So the things that we're going to talk about today in this lecture are the following. So first we'll speak about the making of art history, and by this I mean to talk about the beginnings of art history, right? So it's really interesting to begin in the prehistoric period because this is where we see the beginning of art. But then we have, this brings us to some interesting questions, right? And some art historians and archaeologists have found this as a kind of a dilemma as well. And that brings us to my next point, and the next thing that we'll talk about briefly in this lecture is the difference between art and artifacts. And this does come up, I believe, a little bit in your chapter, but really Stockstead doesn't focus on it. But here we'll talk just a little bit about the kind of the questions centered around the difference between art and artifacts, and how art might become an artifact. And this question will also be something that you'll respond to in your weekly discussion. So make sure that you listen carefully around that this week. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on today in this lecture is how to exhibit ancient art. So this is also another very interesting question, and also I would say a dilemma for art historians, and here more so for curators. So a curator, in case you're unfamiliar, is a person who actually is responsible for organizing and curating, I guess, organizing exhibitions of art of all sorts. And then the last thing we're going to talk about during this lecture is how to exhibit ancient art. Because this is a very kind of weird question, right? How do we exhibit ancient art when realistically a lot of the art that we're going to look at, which is all prehistoric and ancient, doesn't have any record, written record about it. So how do we really know the context for these things? And for this part of the talk, I really want you to make sure that you watch the video that I posted. It's posted within this week's material in the weekly folder, within the material folder. And it's a video from Khan Academy, and I think I've told you about this before, but it's art historians and other theorists who are talking about specific works. And so this week I posted what they say about the quote-unquote Venus of Willendorf, otherwise known as the Woman of Willendorf. She's more popularly known as the Venus, but in recent years she's been kind of repositioned as the Woman of Willendorf, and we'll talk about that in just a second as well. But this leads me to my first point, and you might think that it's a little bit off, or you might wonder, why are we talking about like this contemporary building right now when we're supposed to be talking about prehistoric art? So I like to start at the beginning of the semester when I talk about prehistory by talking about contemporary history, by thinking about this space right here. And if I had you in class, I'd say, does anyone know what this spot is? And hopefully, well, most likely you would all say, we have no idea what that is, which is totally fine. This is the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in New Mexico. It was opened in 1999, and it will be closing in 2030. So basically, as the title suggests, it's a waste isolation plant, and this building is on top of a huge vault of nuclear fuel and radioactive material. And all of this material is 2 miles underneath this building, and this is just kind of the building where the business happens, to make sure that that material stays there as far below the earth as it can. And it holds about 850,000 barrels of nuclear fuel and radioactive material. And so there's actually been some talk about this recently, and there's an art historian who recently wrote about this space, because what's happening now is that they've just had a meeting, a panel in 1991, to think about how we are going to make a permanent marker for this space once we're gone. Because realistically, all of the substances, these explosive, radioactive, nuclear substances that are 2 miles below this site, they will last at the least for 10,000 years. Some of them will be deactivated, but most of these substances will remain active for up to 2 million years. So that's a very, very, very long time. So it's almost a time frame that we can't even comprehend. And so in 1991, there was a panel formed around creating kind of an image of danger to make sure that the future residents of the world know that this is a dangerous site. And why is this important? Why can't we just have like a sign that says, hey, radioactive material, stay away. Well, the reason why this is important is because images and languages change over time. So this is why I think this is important to talk about right now, is because with the things that we're talking about today, the objects, the artifacts, the artworks that we talk about are, really old. They're ancient, right? Some of the things that we're going to look at would come from uh, 30,000 before the Common Era, that is to say BCE. So obviously the things that we're going to be looking at, especially within this lecture, the woman of Willendorf, who is from about 25,000 before the Common Era. So remember, we are in the Common Era now. So we are 2,000 years, 2017 years after zero, the year zero, and the objects that we're talking about during this lecture are going to be from 30,000 or 25 to 30,000 years before year zero. Where began our current time period, our current era. And so this is a lot of time that has passed since these objects were created. And many of the objects have absolutely no reference point for us except for perhaps their geography. So the reason why I like to talk about the waste isolation pilot plant is because in 1991, a panel of people, the government hired a panel of people to get together and talk about in what way should we create a marker um, to make sure that future generations, a million years from now, understand that this is a dangerous site not to be drilled into, because some of that radioactive material, as I said, will still be active. And so the panel got together, and a few people on the panel were art historians, a few were artists, a few were archaeologists, geographers, economists, all sorts of different theorists who were coming together. But for the reasons of this lecture, I think it's important to emphasize that art historians and artists were there because, these are people who are trained to make and read images and markers. And so these are some of the images that came up. Designers were there too, and this is the type of kind of monumental marker that would be. This is not the one that was chosen, but there were a series of kind of these concept drawings that were presented by designers that were supposed to be images of danger. Like, how do we represent a monument that says, this is dangerous, stay away, right? Because as we know, a million years from now, our language will very likely have changed in some ways. If we think about the history of art and just more generally the history of the world, languages change all the time. And for us, it doesn't seem, really like that at all. But, we've only lived, for, maybe many of you, 2 decades, right? Maybe 20 years, maybe 25, maybe 30 years. So, but much more broadly, language does change, symbolism changes, imagery changes. The meaning that we imbue in imagery and in language changes over time, and that's just a fact. And so it's very likely that in a million years from now, when some of these radioactive materials are still active, the imagery around danger will also have changed. So these people have been put together on a panel to try to figure out what is a universal, timeless image for change. So here's one that we see. They came up with a spike field. So we all see sharp things as dangerous, right? Spikes as dangerous. So these would be just gigantic, miles and miles of these spikes over this site, hoping that people would see this and know that they're not supposed to intervene. Here's another couple drawings. As you can see, I'm not going to go into these in detail, but the one on the right was supposed to be these hot kind of plates. And remember, this is in New Mexico, so it's very, very, very hot there most of the year. And so in the middle of the desert, right? And so these hot kind of plates would have been placed for miles kind of over the site. And they would have and the idea is that they would have been too hot to even touch, and they would have radiated heat, so that people around the space would not be interested in getting close. So think about that too. We also associate that with danger, right? If something is too hot, we stay away from it. Um, but hopefully in your mind, these are the images that come up, right? Danger. So we have skulls, exclamation points, the word danger itself. We have the biohazard sign down here, as you can see. This one seems to be a bloody hand, which I wouldn't personally associate with danger, but here again, this is just kind of my Google image search for the word danger, and this is what comes up, right? So these are all the images that we are used to seeing in terms of danger. But here's my point. Imagery always changes. So how do we really know what things are going to mean, and how will we know in the future? So I like to use this painting by Fra Angelico, the Crucifixion, and this is a 13th century painting by a French artist. But what I want to show you down here is the skull at the bottom of at the base of the cross where Jesus is raised. And why is this important? Well, we just talked about how important the skull is as an image of danger, right? As a symbol and as an icon of danger. But here, you know, throughout history, and especially tied to Christian history and the imagery of Christianity, we have the skull often used as a symbol right below the dying Jesus that is a symbol of rebirth, right? It's supposed to be a symbol of Adam and Eve and essentially rebirth. And so now we think of the skull in a very different way, right? But then the skull was very much associated with rebirth, and for many people it was associated with kind of a reminder that to take care in your life because death will always await you, not necessarily danger. And so imagery always changes, and this is my point. And the reason why I like to think about how imagery changes like this over time is because this week we're talking about, and when you read your book, you'll look at all these different objects here. And it's very interesting because people who write about these objects, including Marilyn Stockstead, the author of your book, all theorists who write about these ancient objects, they have to speculate, right? These are not things that we don't actually have a written record about anything that I've posted on this page. And instead, theorists and archaeologists and art historians mostly talk about these images through a broader lens of context. So usually, we'll talk about this one in just a second, the woman of Willendorf, over on the far right. She was found in Germany, right? So there's a German context to it. There's a locality to where she's most likely from. But most of the meaning that we make around her now is actually produced by people at the time when they found her, much, much later, thinking about what they thought an image like this would mean contemporarily to them, right? When her founders found her. So that's just, I always like to start talking about prehistory in this way, so you always know everything that you are reading at this time has actually been produced by someone. It's not actually necessarily a factual history of the object, but rather what someone has theorized about it. And, certain important theorists have become more viable. And so, for instance, the Venus over here, who we'll talk about in a second, her early theorists called her Venus, right? And they thought she was a goddess of fertility. When actually there's really no proof of that, okay? And so we'll talk about her in just a second. But this is kind of how I like to start the lecture, thinking about how that happens. So with that being said, these are some of the questions that I want us to be thinking about while you're reading this week's chapter. And as you're thinking about how you're going to discuss this week's material. So for one, how and when do artifacts and objects become art? What are the inherent problems with defining the beginning of art history? So all of a sudden art history begins, right? At the beginning of history itself. It's very kind of provoking question. And then number 3, how is the making of ancient history informed by our framing of the past in the present? So Here you'll think about exhibition and display, knowledge production itself, who produces knowledge, and how does that knowledge become reified, especially in our art historical textbooks. How do collections get formed, that is to say in museums. What do museums collect and what do they value as art and as artifacts? How are objects grouped? And then lastly, language. How do these things kind of inform the way that we frame our past? Okay, so here I want to take a quick moment to look at a map. So we're here in the Stone Age. Um, we've got the Paleolithic period, the Neolithic period, and the Bronze Age. And your book will go through all of those terms with you and split this chapter up into 3 different kind of periods as I've outlined here. But I really wanted to focus today just on 2 spots on this map because this is a shorter lecture, and we'll talk first about Willendorf, and this is Austria where we found the Venus or the Woman of Willendorf, and then we'll also go over to France where we have a lot of different caves, early caves with cave paintings. Lacoste, you can see here, is a very important early cave, but today we'll look at Peshmerle. And that cave is actually one of my favorites to look at. So we'll take a second and look at both of these. But I wanted to start by thinking about this question of how art becomes an artifact. So for this instance, I've actually gone to the Oxford English Dictionary to define the word art. And this is what I found. It says, quote, the application of skill to the arts of imitation and design, painting, engraving, sculpture, architecture. The cultivation of these in its principles, practice, and results. The skillful production of the beautiful in visual forms, end quote. So notice that beautiful is important there, right? So the production of something beautiful. Okay, in contrast, when we look to the same dictionary and we look to the word artifact, we see artifact is defined as, quote, anything made by human art and workmanship, an artifact, an artificial product. In archaeology, applied to the rude products of aboriginal workmanship as distinguished from natural remains. End quote. So then I've decided the artifact then is anything created by humankind, okay? And art is a particular kind of artifact, a group of objects under the broad umbrella of artifact, in which beauty has been achieved through the application of skill. And so if you were in class with me right now, I'd ask us to have a discussion about this, about how much beauty is necessary, right, for an artifact to become an art object. But the other question is how much skill is needed, right? And if you were to take Art History Survey 2, later in the course we'd actually talk about craft, and there's also kind of a weird divide between art and craft too that I would say is akin to the divide between art and artifacts. And then what's really important there is skill, but also utility. So how are objects used? And I would argue that an artifact oftentimes has a utility to it. And then here we see that art often has maybe sometimes less utility except for to be looked at, but oftentimes there's the application of more skills. So, and this is something that you'll kind of dig into a little more in your weekly discussion, so keep that in mind. Now for the Venus of Willendorf. So I wanted to talk about the Venus briefly because she's very, very important and because she allows us to think really critically about how history is made, both through language and naming, but also through exhibition, okay? So, what are some of the things that you notice right away about the exhibition of this piece? Well, hopefully you all had a chance to check out the video by now that I posted. If you haven't, I ask that you just go ahead and pause this lecture and go ahead and watch it. It's only 5 minutes long. It's very, very short. But it really helps you to get an understanding of the exhibition space where the Venus or Woman of Willendorf now resides. She is at the National Museum of, the Museum of Natural History in Vienna, in Austria. That's where she was found. And you might not see her, but here she is. She's this tiny little white blob here within this giant glass case within this kind of small room that's been constructed around her. And if you were to see, watch that video, you'd also see a shot of the space that's been built around her from an external view. So she's actually kind of been built within, there's been a temple of sorts that's been built around her that says Venus of Willendorf on it. And this is the way she's been displayed for some time. And I want to note also that she is in a natural history museum, right? She's not in an art museum. So where does she exist on the art scale then? She's an artifact in some ways because she's in the Natural History Museum. Because, right, art objects usually exist in art museums. So there's also something very interesting there that's happening. She was found at the turn of the century in 1908, even though she's from 28 to 25,000 before the Common Era, and here you see it's abbreviated as BCE, just in case that's a newer thing for some of you, which is just fine. So here she's exhibited within this kind of temple space as this kind of icon of history, of ancient history. And so what does this do for us? Well, if you watch the video, you'd also know that there's music that plays with her. There's a little button next to this exhibition case that you're supposed to press, and it's interactive, right? It actually begins to play this kind of flute music that actually might have nothing at all to do with the object itself. But this is the way that the object is framed, and this is the way then that we actually see it and that we engage with it. And so this is how we kind of think about the history of the object, even though, as we know, there's no written artifacts or no written record of anything about this object. So we really don't know much about it. But that doesn't ever keep us back from theorizing. And so what has been theorized about this object? Well, first of all, she's very tiny. She could actually fit into the palm of your hand. As you can see here, she's very small. And so she was probably transitory. She probably moved from space to space with some sort of nomadic community, a community that moves seasonally often. The other things that have been said about her is that she was a fertility goddess. Well, as we all know, if you think about the term itself, Venus, Venus is named after the Roman goddess of love and beauty, okay? So just her naming in the early turn of the century in the 1900s as a Venus caused everybody to believe that she was kind of a goddess of love, a Roman goddess of love, even though there were absolutely no records to reify that. And this was just what she was named, right? Because she's a nude female object. And so this is the problem, right? We have these kind of naming of the objects, which reifies them in certain ways in history in non-factual ways, okay? So this is something that we have happen quite often. And this goes not only for the Venus, but also for a much, much more broad set of nude female sculptures that we find, small ones like this. And once you read the book, you'll see a variety of them. All of them have been called Venus at one point in their life. And so this is a problem. The other thing I wanted to get at today was exhibition and how that changes the way that we view the object as well. So here she's actually entombed in this kind of temple, reifying the image of her as a goddess. She's also got the wide hips and the large breasts, which in many cultures would exemplify mothering and matriarchy. So many theorists have associated her with those types of things, with fertility. People have said, oh, she must be a fertility goddess because of this. And again, we really don't know anything, so it's not as though anyone can say if that's a fact or not. The other thing I wanted to mention just real briefly is the music. So she's put in this kind of dark room with music, and this music has really nothing to do with her past. It's not as though we have any idea the type of music, if any, these ancient peoples would have listened to. But as people come into this space and hear the music, they automatically assume certain things about the object. So this is just my way to get you thinking about how exhibition informs the way that we think about the history of objects, and how in our minds we can make up things about them according to how they are exhibited and historified within the textbooks. And just to show you a few examples of Venus figures, these are kind of your traditional Venuses. Here we have The Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli. This is a 15th century piece. Venus de Milo, and this is from 101 before the Common Era, so a little earlier. And then we've got Venus of Urbino, which might be on your radar already, by Titian, and that's in the 1530s. So all of these are actual very traditional images of the Venus, who is, you know, the goddess of love. And so this is the way she's usually rendered, nude like this, similar in some ways to the Venus, but absolutely completely different from the Venus. So it's interesting to kind of juxtapose these two and think about how at the turn of the century there were impulses to have the Venus, the woman of Willendorf, be called a Venus. The last thing I did want to mention today was I wanted to talk just a bit about these early cave paintings. And we looked at Peshmeral in France just a second ago, so hopefully you can think of that image in your mind of the map so you know where we are. Now we're a little bit south and west of Austria within the Western European continent. So here we have spotted horses in human hands. The thing that I really like about this, and of course, you know, I'm only talking about a little bit from your textbook, but the thing I really love about this is how the artist has used the rock formation, as you can see here, within the artwork. So the artist has used the rock formation, the natural curves of the rock, to actually be part of the horse's head, right? And so that's something that's really unique and important at this time, especially within prehistory, this early ancient period. But the other thing that is really important is these handprints. So these handprints, as early signatures, and we see these actually a lot in cave paintings, but this is kind of the first time that we see these handprints. And really, theorists have talked about these as being signatures in some ways by the artists. So the other thing I wanted to bring up when we think about the way that history changes with theorists is how the social function of cave paintings has changed over time. And so in the early 20th century, theorists believed that the social function of cave painting was to strengthen a clad, to strengthen the bonds between a clad, okay, and to in some ways enhance animal fertility. And then later on we have Solomon Reinach, who's French. Remember, many of these early caves are in France. That's not to say that there weren't others elsewhere, and you'll find more in your book. But it's also important to point out that there were a lot of ancient caves in Africa as well. But we have Reinach, who's thinking about cave paintings as expressions of the sympathetic magic. So in other words, by painting a bison, for instance, a reclining bison, there's this idea that magically hunters would be able to find prey while they were sleeping, just because of the power of the image. And then years later, we've got Henri Breuil, who's also a French theorist. He's thinking about cave paintings as caves as places of worship, so the paintings themselves become spaces for initiation rites. And then again, years later, we have a couple other theorists, Steve Milton, who thinks about the hoof prints, the patterns of feces, and the hide coloring as being kind of a textbook for novice hunters, so teaching devices, right? So within a group, young hunters would be taught about the animals, the local animals, and the behaviors of local animals by looking at these paintings. For instance, if you were to look at this painting, he would say, you know, there was this type of horse that existed at this time that actually is extinct, that does not exist anymore, that had spots on it, a white horse with spots on it, with a black mane. And, you know, Mithun would say, well, this is a teaching device so that the young hunters could look at these images and know what the horse will look like when they go out on the hunt. And then lastly, we have Lewis Williams, who theorized cave paintings as objects used for shamanism. So this is the belief that certain people can travel outside their bodies, mediating between this world and that of spirits. And the idea also was that the paintings would sometimes be part of this kind of ritual of shamanism in which the painting itself could be a device of mediation between this world and the next. And we'll stop there for today. That's all I really wanted to get to within this lecture for the week. And so a lot of questions for you to think about. Um, Hopefully you make sure that you watch this. Hopefully you're watching this before you discuss anything, because this will give you kind of hints on what to say and what to think about. Make sure you're reading your textbook. Again, let me know if you have any questions at all. Take quiz number 1. It's on the readings, and it's not really on this lecture per se, but it's much more on those readings. So make sure you have your book by your side. You'll have 40 minutes for each quiz. Good luck to you, and let me know if you have questions. I'll see you next week.